Hello, and welcome to this post edition of the Election Show. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Greer. I'm a professor of political science at Fordham University, and joining me today, as always via Zoom, is Matt McDermott, communication strategist and vice president of Whitman Insight Strategies, and also with me is political analyst and professor of political science at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. Hello, gentlemen.
How is everyone feeling?
Well, we look pretty good going on a few hours of sleep. I'm just going to put that out there, considering everyone's running on fumes. But as we know, we had record turnout for early voting. We had record turnout for absentee ballots. This is the highest voting numbers we've seen in a century, if not in the history of our democracy. And many folks were expecting much more of a blue wave than I think we saw. The voting is still being counted. States still haven't come in. The president made some speech from the White House last night, which I want us to talk about the legality of doing a campaign speech from inside of the White House. But Matt, I want to start with you. Where do we stand? What do we know? And I guess I want to ask you if you could specifically address the question that a lot of Democrats, based on the polling, thought that Joe Biden would sort of sweep particular states that we're still waiting to hear from. Michigan, certified. Michigan, Wisconsin, even Pennsylvania, North Carolina. What happened to the wave? And also the Senate wave that people thought would come in with Joe Biden as well.
I think the most important thing to say at the outset is this election outcome is still a work in progress. I mean, many others have been alerting viewers for months now that this was going to be a drawn out process because of the way in which we conducted this election in the middle of a global pandemic. We had a ton of early votes. We had a ton of mail-in votes. We had a ton of in-person early votes. And those all need to be counted, particularly in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where Republican elected officials in those states prevented the attorney general in those states from counting ballots earlier than election day. And so I think we just need to remember that we're in the situation we're in right now because one, so many people participated in early voting, and two, because this is what Republicans wanted. They wanted an unknown election result where they could go the day after the election and try to cause mayhem and try to suggest that this election outcome, is predetermined and Donald Trump is going to be reelected, when what we really need to do is candidly just shut up and let the votes be counted. Now, assuming that, sort of looking at the map, looking at the path for Joe Biden and Donald Trump, it is safe to say that Joe Biden, in all likelihood, will be the next president of the United States. And frankly, the path that the Trump campaign is trying to set forth today requires them to win states that they've already lost. I mean, their strategy at this point is to essentially suggest that both Wisconsin and Michigan, where Joe Biden has a lead, and in fact, Wisconsin has been called for Joe Biden, that those states are still in play and that votes have been illegally counted and this needs to go to the courts. On the flip side, he's also arguing that Arizona, which has been called by a number of different networks, there's irregularities in the vote and whatever else he's saying in his latest diatribe, and that was fairly uncalled to. So his path is essentially to suggest that states that Joe Biden has already won, he in fact did not win. Biden's path is pretty clear right now. If he's able to hold on to Arizona, which has been called by a number of networks, and Nevada, all he needs to do is win Wisconsin, which again has been called by a number of networks now, and Michigan, where he has an increasing lead, and it looks like the remainder of the vote outstanding is in Detroit. And so the path to 270 for Joe Biden is evidently clear, and all indications suggest that Pennsylvania and Georgia, which are both still outstanding, the remaining ballots in those states look especially good for Biden and may very well win one or both of those states. So it's looking like a Joe Biden victory. Is it narrower than we may have thought heading into the election? Entirely possible. I think more than anything else, though, we really need to allow the votes to be counted so we can figure out, once those votes are counted, what things look like, what the margins look like, and just how big of a win did Democrats have last night.
Right. And we know that we can look at the popular vote once all the votes are counted. And I have a feeling that Joe Biden will definitely win the popular vote as well. And what a lot of folks are concerned about is what you laid out as the electoral college vote. So Lincoln, I want to bring you in here because as Matt, always lays out for us, these democratic strategies and the way that possibly did not happen, and we still have to see. But I want to ask you more about Donald Trump and sort of his court strategy. I was just on a network with a right-wing strategist who was consistently making the point that the states that Matt laid out, all of them are controlled by Republican or by Democratic governors. And so this is part of the problem because they've appointed people that, I'm not saying there's fraud, but, and so the way that Donald Trump and his ilk throw out a baseless scenario, but then that becomes part of the dialogue that we're most likely going to see, especially as the president tries to challenge Wisconsin and Michigan, stop voting in certain places, make sure there is extended voting in other places. What are you thinking about his use of the courts in the upcoming days/weeks to hopefully give himself the victory of 270 or more?
Well, a few things about Donald Trump and the courts. We're all here in New York City, and New Yorkers know that no one's afraid of Donald Trump's lawsuits, right? Donald Trump sues everyone all the time. It doesn't get anywhere. It's almost like a publicity stunt in the pre-presidential Donald Trump. So this is not some fine legal mind, this is a man who actually hired Rudy Giuliani as his personal attorney. So we can say with some confidence he's not getting the finest legal advice. Nonetheless, as I see it, his legal strategy is get this to the Supreme Court and just hope for a party line vote. But the question for me is, what is the it in that sentence? What is the ask? That you don't count probably close to 1 million outstanding votes in Pennsylvania? How do you could say that we're going to argue that these 5,000 votes were somehow tampered with or they were filled out wrong or something, but to just say, stop the counting because I'm losing or because I'm winning at this moment, you have to make a better legal argument than that, because for the Supreme Court to rule for him in that case, they not only potentially destabilize the country, but they potentially jeopardize their stature and their future. But the problem is that's still not enough, right? Because as Matt pointed out, Biden's essentially at 270. I don't know why they haven't called Michigan, right? Michigan, the hope for Donald Trump in Michigan is that somehow ballots in Detroit come like 3-1 for Donald Trump. That seems just beyond the realm of possibility. He's going to lose Michigan. He's already lost Wisconsin. And I suspect that Nevada, where he's hoping for some magical Republican votes, stays with Biden, but by a very close margin. So he's got this kind of two-pronged legal strategy: stop the voting there, and then overturn on technicalities, kind of a recount situation, and go in these 4 states and hope to win 1, or these 3 states and hope to win 1. And there's just no serious legal strategy behind that. It's just politics. But the problem is that we have seen the extreme politicization of the courts. Not for nothing, 2 of the 3 Supreme Court justices he appointed, not Gorsuch, but Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett, were part of Jim Baker's legal team in 2000 in Bush v. Gore on the Republican side. So these are not legal minds. These are Republican operatives, and Republican operatives will side with Trump. The one caveat here is that the Democrats' disappointing from the Democratic perspective showing in the Senate changes the ballgame, because what it does is the Republicans know that they're going to have a foothold in Washington. And Mitch McConnell can live with a Senate majority in a Biden presidency. In some sense, that makes his life easier. And what you're not seeing today, which is really critical and important, is you're not seeing all of the Republican Party lined up behind Donald Trump, which means they may not want the fight. They may be ready to hold on to the power they have. They picked up seats in the House, they held the Senate, and let Biden come in. So we'll see how this plays out, but there's no serious legal strategy here. It's just scream lawsuit and hope for the best.
Right. And so I think the worry is that the longer this goes on, the more the president has the bully pulpit, though, to continue with, falsehood and what I have been arguing are lies. And we even saw last night with his diatribe from the White House, where several networks said, you know what, we've actually got to cut this off because this is not based on fact or truth in any capacity. Matt, as a strategist, I want to bring you in here. What states, I know right now we're focused on Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Georgia, right? And Arizona just a little bit. Is there a particular state that you are still keeping your eye on, or are you looking at the whole map? I mean, just for our viewers, 270 is the magic number. And so until one candidate gets over 270, we cannot declare a winner. So is there a particular state that still has your interest as a strategist?
Yeah, well, first, let me just underline the absurdity of the Trump campaign strategy. Their argument is essentially the election's over, we need to stop counting ballots, therein I won. The problem with that strategy is at the moment, if we were to in every state stop counting ballots right now, Joe Biden is the winner of this election. He's ahead in enough states to get him to 270 electoral votes. So there's just an absurdity to this entire conversation wherein I don't know what world they're living in, but they've already lost this election. Frankly, their only hope is these states continue to count the votes. They find some votes for Donald Trump, and he's able to rebound from the deficits he has right now. I think the states I'm watching over the next 12 to 24 hours are really two. One is in the South, Georgia. The votes are starting to come in from Atlanta and the surrounding collar counties. Donald Trump's lead there is down to about 65,000 votes, and that continues to narrow. It sounds like there's about 200 or so thousand additional ballots to count. It looks like those will be especially favorable to Joe Biden. If Joe Biden is able to pull into the lead in Georgia, I mean, that's the ball game. Not only does that get him well beyond 270, more than likely that gets him over 300 electoral votes. And more importantly, when we think about the Senate, Joe Biden either winning or coming awfully close in Georgia potentially allows Jon Ossoff to head into a runoff as well, along with the other special election that's heading into the runoff. And there'd be 2 Senate runoffs in December in Georgia, meaning that Democrats would actually still have a chance of getting to 50 votes, and with Joe Biden and the presidency, a majority in the Senate. And so the Senate is much less favorable towards Democrats than it was going into this race. But if Joe Biden is able to close that margin in Georgia, and Jon Ossoff can get David Perdue under 50% and head that election into a runoff, boy, oh boy, would I want to own a TV network in Atlanta for the next 6 weeks, because those 2 races will define whether Democrats can actually have a shot at controlling the Senate.
Right. And shout out to Stacey Abrams, Fair Fight, the New Georgia Project, and all the grassroots work that's been going on for well over a decade, planting those seeds in the state of Georgia to make it much more purple over the past few years. Lincoln, we know that you love the great state of California. Not too many surprises there. We know Georgia, the last time they went for a Democrat was 1992 with Bill Clinton. California's been solidly blue, so there weren't any surprises. Obviously, the vice presidential nominee, Kamala Harris, is from the great state of California. I think Senator Feinstein, if she decides to run for re-election, might have some trouble because of her behavior during the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation hearings. But is there a particular state that you're still paying attention to besides your home state of California?
I have to say, I'm kind of with Matt on this. For me, Georgia's the state I'm watching for the reason that he outlined. Right now, Trump has to turn over Nevada or turn over Wisconsin or Michigan. But a Biden win in Georgia, and right now, I woke up this morning thinking it's about 50-50. Now I think Biden's got a real chance, better than 50% of pulling off Georgia, a win in Georgia. If he does that, then he's not at 270, 271. He's into the 280s. And then we wait for Pennsylvania. And if he's into the 280s, you know, if Trump has to turn over one state and he focuses on some technicality he's able to find and build a legal and political strategy around there and mobilize, if necessary, his kind of thuggy supporters to physically intimidate people to stop the counting, he has a shot. But if he has to go to 3 states, he doesn't have a shot. Georgia is, for me, an important state. It's also an important state because you were really seeing last night, what struck me is that the Democrats are building a Western wall. And we talk about the blue wall in the Midwest, but we now have from Washington all the way to Hawaii, which is an island, so it's not exactly contiguous, or a set of islands, and then Nevada and Arizona and Colorado. This is becoming a party that is, the center of gravity is shifting westward and a little bit southward. And Georgia would be part of that, which means that in the future, we don't have to agonize over carrying these Rust Belt states where demographically, the changes that are helping making the country better for the Democrats aren't happening as fast in those states.
Well, you know, it's interesting. You mentioned the word demographics, and I do want to talk about, a conversation that so many people were shocked about last night, and that's the Latino vote. And so we saw, our friends in Florida, and I can't talk badly about Florida because both sides of my family are from Florida. I still have the majority of my family members are in Florida. So when I talk about cutting Florida off with a pair of scissors, I want to do that, but I just want to grab all of my family members really quickly and drag them to New York and then cut off Florida. I'll do that first. But in the state of Florida, lots of people were shocked and surprised by Miami-Dade County and Broward County. And there seems to be a disconnect in understanding the diversity of the Latino community in the United States. Now, I've written a book called Black Ethnics. I'm well aware that there is great diversity within the Black community, Afro-Caribbean immigrants, African immigrants, Native-born Black Americans. There's class diversity, there's geographic diversity. It doesn't really show up in hyper robust ways in presidential politics. We see a lot more activity on local level politics. Matt, I want to bring you back in here with the Latino vote. That was a conversation that came up among so many people because they just couldn't understand how Donald Trump did so well with Latinos. And for those of us who study politics, we're looking at a particular group of Latinos who are from Cuba and Venezuela and Argentina, places that, or demographics that traditionally go Republican. So why the shock this year when the data suggests that Latinos in Miami are not the same as Latinos in Texas or Arizona or even New York City?
Yeah, I mean, this election, more than any in our recent past, I think really shows the scale of not only the diversity, but the difference within the Latino community in the United States, especially in Florida. I mean, the differences between Cuban Americans in Florida and Puerto Rican Americans in Florida, has always been immense. And I think it just really took this election to show the chasm that exists there. And there's really two things at play here. One is Republicans have obviously tried to go after the Cuban American community in Florida for decades, going back to the Bush years. Some years they're successful, some years less so. They certainly were successful this year, in part because, just to be candid and frank, their messaging against Democrats, their attacks on Democrats as being socialists, clearly has some level of effect among that community. I mean, you could see it in the polling, you could see it in discussions and interviews and focus groups in that community. Clearly, that attack message has resonance among Cuban Americans in Florida. On the flip side, though, I think it actually speaks to a bigger, more important issue for Democrats to really grapple with moving forward, one in which we've actually talked about in past shows, which is the Democratic message on the economy is just not resonating with Latino voters. I'll just be, perfectly blunt about that. And moving forward, I think
And what is that messaging, Matt?
I don't know. Do you? I mean, honestly, as a messenger of the party, it is not clear to me what we are doing to effectively communicate our message of prosperity, ingenuity, the individual and their ability to really build their own future and build an economic security for their family in America. Democrats, for a lot of reasons, just don't have an especially strong message when it comes to the economy among Latino Americans. And we need to do better at it. I think there are some focus areas moving forward that Democrats should be focused on, things like paid family leave, things having to do with safety and security of your family. Those are bread and butter issues that far too often are actually not communicated in Latino outreach among Democrats, and it should be, because at the end of the day, Latinos in America care more about what's happening in their household, what's happening to their family, particularly during a global pandemic and an economic crisis, than they do, to be candid, about the border wall.
And Lincoln, what do you say to that?
Well, I'm going to reveal my West Coast bias here. Mexican Americans are the ones who are going to put Joe Biden into the White House. Arizona and Nevada went for Biden because of the huge Mexican American vote, much bigger than in other states. I mean, much bigger than, like, in, say, Texas, carrying close to 2/3 of the Latino vote in those states, and that's a heavily Mexican American vote. So I very much agree with everything Matt said, but again, the diversity of the Latino vote. In the West and the Southwest, it is a heavily Democratic vote. And the other piece of this, and I generally agree with your comments about the economic message, but there is a component of the message that resonates a great deal, and that is support for organized labor. And as you move to states like California, particularly Nevada, where the hotel workers union is absolutely essential to any Democratic victory, those labor unions are heavily Latino, and they are kind of remaking Democratic politics and bringing those states into the blue column. The defeat in Florida, Florida is always very tempting, and the Democrats generally come up empty-handed there, and they spend a lot of time there. And it's often the kind of debrief Matt gave about, for example, the Cuban or the Venezuelan vote, that is kind of a long-term problem for the Democrats there. What the victories in Arizona and Nevada suggest to me is that next time the Democrats can focus on winning Arizona and Nevada. And I would say in 2024, Texas will be a stronger state for the Democrats than Florida. And the reason for that is the difference in the different Latino vote there than in Florida. Now, Latinos in Florida, again, in Texas, again, heavily Mexican American, did not go as strongly for Biden, still by a majority, as in Nevada, Arizona, and California. And in my view, that's because of Texas's kind of anti-labor laws, which makes it harder for workers to organize into labor unions and then get brought into progressive politics that way. So again, this is a very close election. Without a big Latino vote in Nevada and Arizona, we're looking at a very, very different Wednesday morning right now.
Well, I think, both of you said something that made me think because, I was on a podcast last night talking about sort of Florida and Ohio and how we would seen them as swing states, but maybe it's time, as you suggested, Lincoln, to sort of build this blue wall on the West Coast, secure the blue wall on the East Coast, work on, say, Arizona and Nevada, and, maybe Florida and Ohio aren't swing states anymore. Maybe they're just red and we need to move our focus, especially since the trends in Texas are trending more and more Democratic each and every 2-year cycle. But for that, I wanted to ask, because both of you mentioned kind of this, I look at it as the Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan sort of blue ceiling. I mean, I guess that's what we would call it in the United States. But we know that the law in Wisconsin is if the loser is within 1 percentage point of the presumptive winner, then they are allowed to challenge. And we were getting news that Donald Trump has decided to demand a recount in the state of Wisconsin. Matt, having looked at Wisconsin closely, what do you really think that it's well within his legal right to do so? What do you think he will find, or will it just be the narrative that Wisconsin's possibly stolen, which will be enough to sort of delegitimize Joe Biden in some capacity?
Well, as the lawsuit precedent, it's certainly within his right to do it. He'll come up unsuccessful. I mean, there have been now 2 or 3 dozen recounts in modern Wisconsin history. The average vote swing out of those recounts is somewhere between 100 and 200 votes. Donald Trump is currently down by about 21,000 votes. So the idea that a recount alone will somehow win him Wisconsin is just illogical and will not happen. Joe Biden has won Wisconsin regardless of whether there is a recount. And I think it really speaks to, I think, the ability for Democrats to upend what happened in 2016 and keep the upper Midwest in play. I mean, I think our concern after Hillary Clinton's loss was, are places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania just getting farther and farther out of reach for Democrats, or did we just have a fluke election? And I think what we're seeing now, we've still got a lot of votes left to count, particularly in Pennsylvania. But what I think we're seeing is Democrats' ability to still hold those 3 states in a competitive election. I mean, Joe Biden, at the end of the day, will win the popular vote nationally by probably about 4%, and will have won Pennsylvania, I think, Michigan, and Wisconsin by 1 or maybe 2 points. And so I think that bodes well for Democrats moving forward to be able to hold those. And to your point a few moments ago, I think the election result we're seeing with a very close potential win in Georgia and the results we saw in Arizona suggests that Democrats actually now really have 2 paths to the election. One is through the upper Midwest and Pennsylvania, and the other is through the Sun Belt, through Georgia, Arizona. And I think an election very soon in the next decade, a place like Texas.
Right. I mean, Texas is fascinating to me on a host of levels. And Lincoln, we only have a few more minutes. We know the Biden camp is essentially creating this message of unity. Joe Biden is not going to be a president just for blue states. He wants to be a president for the United States of America, not as divisive as Donald Trump has said. But they're very clear that they want to count every single ballot, but they also only want to count it once, right? This isn't an attempt to try and double dip for people who voted in person and also requested an absentee ballot. what are you, really quickly, what are your thoughts on Wisconsin and this recount? I mean, keep in mind, as Matt mentioned, Wisconsin and Michigan, they also have Democratic leadership, right? They have Democratic governors, two very progressive African American lieutenant governors. So we know that there's some action there for the Democrats to hold on to. But what do you think about this recount idea?
What we saw again this time was that these three states are going to be very close. They are not solid blue. They're going to be contested in the next election. With specific regards to the recount, Scott Walker, who is hardly some socialist, right? He's a right-wing former governor of Wisconsin. He tweeted out, "You're never going to do this. It's never going to work. You're not going to change that many votes." One reason for that, ironically, in Wisconsin in particular, is that for a northern state, Wisconsin is a pretty strong voter suppression state. And while that's unfortunate, at this moment in time, what that means is if you manage to get through that gauntlet and get yourself registered and cast your vote is pretty kosher.
It's fascinating because the president wants to recount votes in certain states, stop the count in other states. And I think it's just so indicative of the whirlwind roller coaster so many Americans have been on for 4 years, with the president saying one thing and contradicting himself in the next sentence. But I think what was a shock to, I think, many democratic systems, Matt, explicitly, is that I think a lot of Democrats thought that more Americans would be exhausted by this and that more Americans would want to vote Donald Trump out. And I think that there was a bit of a moment of being taken aback by seeing the robust, we know certain states are going to go Republican. That's not surprising, but the robust support that the president still has. I don't think it's enough to necessarily take him over the edge. But when we look at even a state like New York, right? New York City, upstate is pretty red. Most states are pretty red when you start to leave the cities. And so I think that there's still, even when Joe Biden is victorious, there is going to have to be a continued moment of reckoning in this nation because of this hyperpolarization of ideological truths and what we believe in as democratic, small d democratic principles. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have. But I'm so thankful for you all being with us. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. You've been watching the election show. Thank you for voting. If you were able to do so, wear a mask, be safe. We'll see you soon.